its tragic grief and its devastation, and its present day challenges. Bringing Punjab center stage, we have Navdeep Suri, Amandeep Sandhu, and Manreet Sodhi, Someshwar. There is a line in Amandeep's new book called Punjab Journeys Through Fault Lines, which goes, if you want to understand Punjab, be ready to count its corpses. So I thought that was a very fitting kind of line to begin with, because it's also the panel that we're talking about, the inheritance of loss, and beginning with Jallianwala. In my mind, Punjab has had a number of cataclysmic watershed events, and these have marked the land and its people. Beginning from Jallianwala Bagh in 1919, it's 100 years to that event. And then we have partition in 1947, bloodiest, largest migration in the world, arguably. And then we have Blue Star, an attack on one of the, the most sacred spot for the Sikhs. And then we have 1984. So all of these I would consider watershed moments in Punjab's history and its social consciousness. So I'd like to begin with you, Navdeep, today with Jallianwala, because that was 1919, and then we are also commemorating the 100 years. So, and I know that apart from the fact that it's a wonderful piece of literature, it also has a very interesting backstory. So I thought we'd begin with that.
Thanks, Preeti. Pleasure to be on this panel. A lot of books were written over the last couple of years to commemorate the centenary of Jallianwala Bagh. And I think where Khuni Vaisakhi is different, it was written by my grandfather in 1920. He was present at the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. He'd gone with two friends. He survived, left for dead in the stampede, and then wrote this searing long poem in verse, which soon thereafter was banned by the Brits and confiscated. For the next 60 years, in our family, there was occasionally a discussion about this book. There are references to it in my grandfather's own autobiography, which he published in 1949. And just to give a sense of the timeline, my grandfather Nanak Singh was 22 when he wrote this book, poem, and he went on to write 55 novels and became one of Punjabi's greatest, most celebrated writers. So my father, who ended up publishing many of my grandfather's books, so maybe it sounds a bit like a family story, kept looking for this missing, lost work of literature. And the reason it was important was that it was an interesting piece of poetry, but it was also a work of contemporary history describing the events of that time. And then sort of miraculously in 1979-80, two different tracks converged. Gyani Zail Singh had become Home Minister of Punjab, and he had been a great fan of Home Minister of India, and he had been a great fan of my grandfather's writings. So my father approached him that surely you with your clout can help us find this book. And then around the same time, he came across an essay in a literary magazine in Punjab called Drishti, which spoke at length about Nanak Singh as a poet and quoted long excerpts from Khuni Vaisakhi. And my father was stunned that how does this man, one Dr. Gupta, know so much about Khuni Vaisakhi? So through the editor of the magazine, he tracked down Dr. Gupta, went to his house, and said, how do you know this? And he said, I inherited a sack full of books from my grandfather, and they were lying in some shed. And when we moved houses, I went through it, and being a lecturer in Punjabi language, he immediately knew that this is something historic and important. So it first got republished 60 years later in 1980, and then I took up the translation to commemorate the centenary this year, and added on 3 or 4 additional bits. One sort of a translator's note on the challenges of translating something like this when you're a novice. Second, a longish essay which placed the Jallianwala Bagh in context. And third, essays by Justin Rowlett, the great grandson of Sir Sidney Rowlett, because it was the famous or infamous Rowlett Act that had triggered the protests in Jallianwala Bagh and elsewhere. And he contributed a lovely essay called For the Sins of My Great Grandfather. And finally, an essay from an academician, Dr. Bhatia, in Amritsar, who wrote about the genre of protest poetry that emerged in the wake of Khuni Vaisakhi, where other poets of that period took up writing verse and actually speaking from Jallianwala Bagh after the massacre about their sentiments of British rule. So that's the backstory.
Yeah, and a very interesting one. But I also thought that on this day when we've had this Ayodhya judgment, maybe we should have that little passage out of this poem, which actually talks about amity, because it is also at that particular protest that there have been many writers who've remarked on the fact that it was probably the last time that you had Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs all come together. So would you read that for us?
Sure. So, just a bit of context. The massacre happened on the 13th of April 1919. 4 days before that was the Ram Navami festival in Amritsar. And Amritsar was fortunate that it had two stalwart leaders, Dr. Saifuddin Kichlu and Dr. Satyapal, both doctors, curiously. And so there's this passage which I'll read out. And the reason it's important is that the historicity of this, and I said that this is a work of contemporary history, was subsequently reflected in the British records, in the Hunter Commission inquiries and so on, that the Brits were so spooked by the show of Hindu-Muslim unity and the impact that it potentially had on the divide and rule policies that they were pursuing, that next day, both Dr. Satyapal and Dr. Kichlu were arrested and whisked away to Dharamshala. Hindus and Muslims, they gathered together to rejoice at a festival, oh my friends. Brotherhood conveyed by Muslims that day, beyond incredible, it was, my friends. A festival of Hindus, though it was, Muslims made it just their own, my friends. Tis hard to describe this feeling new. A miracle it truly seemed, my friends. Doctors Saifuddin, Satyapal together tread on a path united, my friends. The seed of friendship between these faiths descended from heavens itself, my friends. Discord and difference seemed to vanish. Each saw the other as brother, my friends, shared the same glass to drink their water, sat down for meals together, my friends.
And I'd just like to take this a little further because you belong to Amritsar, your family has been there. So when you've lived there, you've studied there, when you go now and you see that heritage walk and you see the new Jallianwala memorial refurbished, redone, decorated, what do you feel about it now when you go there?
I think it just lacks the emotion, the pathos that should have been represented. Whoever was the creative mind behind it, I think it's pretty poorly done with those weird silhouettes in hedges of soldiers trying to shoot and so on. I mean, it's kitsch. But I think a point that I've reflected in the essay that I wrote, which is called The Book, the Bagh and Our Bauji, which is what we used to call my grandfather, is the sadness that growing up in Amritsar, having lived in that city, the fact that Jallianwala Bagh is maybe 100 yards before the Golden Temple, the fact is that many of my own friends couldn't distinguish between Brigadier Dyer, who ordered the trigger to be pulled, and Lieutenant Governor Michael O'Dwyer, who was the governor of Punjab, who was actually the political mind behind the martial law and everything. And it pained me that if we don't follow our history, if we don't make Jallianwala Bagh a sacred place, as millions of pilgrims who go to the Golden Temple do, then we are certainly losing a connect with our history and we'll be poorer for it.
And also this commemorating of this massacre, I mean, in Punjab and outside of Punjab, in the center. Do you have something to say about that?
Well, I think one thing it's done clearly is revive the memories. I was in Jabalpur about 2 weeks back for a literature festival called Ityadi, and it was remarkable to see in Jabalpur their festival adopt Jallianwala Bagh as a theme, do a beautiful play around it, and actually enact a scene on a street with kids crawling along that street to remind that crawling lane incident, which was one of the punishments imposed by the Raj in Amritsar. So I think what it has done, at least at the popular level, it has sparked this interest in that period of our history. And I think it's important because in many ways, Ramchandra Guha has written that this was the event that turned Gandhi from a British loyalist to a staunch nationalist and implacable opponent of British rule. This is the event after which Tagore renounced his knighthood. And many people see it as the beginning of the end of the British Empire. So it's a piece of our history that we should know about. About the government's role in promoting, I think the less said, the better.
Yeah, so because now that I do live in Amritsar, at least part of the time, partly Delhi but partly Amritsar, I see this kind of thing being a living thing, actually, a living history, which enters people's conversations and which is very much part of their life, whether it's the border, which is so close by, whether it's Jallianwala Bagh, whether it's partition, whether it's what happened with the anti-Sikh rioting in Delhi and elsewhere in this country. And so maybe in the rest of the country, it's not uppermost in your consciousness, but over there, it is something that never goes away. So I'd like to come to you next with this next two watersheds, actually, two of which you have talked about in this particular novel. The Radiance of a Thousand Suns, but also the one that you did before this, which to me, both of them tie in together because you discuss partition and you discuss 84, and you have a woman character who actually spans both of these. Would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, The Radiance of a Thousand Suns is, it's a novel with a wide canvas. It spans the 70 years of modern independent India. And it is a feminist version of that history. And I will tell you why. The thing is that I grew up in a border town between India and Pakistan. And it's called Firozpur. It was a Muslim majority town in 1947. So by the laws of partition, it should have gone to Pakistan, but it didn't. And how a Muslim majority becomes Muslim minority as a child, I thought, it's simple math. It's migration. But the very air of that place is sort of suffused with nostalgia. And when I was growing up, there were always these stories that one would sort of hear, but then the conversations would peter off, especially the stories of women. And as a child, when you're growing up, you never really pay attention to that because there are always other better things to talk about. And when I was growing up, during my adolescence, is when the Sikh militancy happened, which was a separatist movement for Khalistan, a separate nation for the Sikhs. So I lived through that as well. Once again, didn't pay much attention to it while I was going through it. But at some point in my life, I took a break from my corporate career. And that's when all these sort of memories started to flood back. And I thought maybe I should just put pen to paper and get rid of them. That was 19 years back, and I'm on to my fifth book. And I'm trying to sort of exorcise the demons of, I guess, 47 and 84 both. And the reason I talk about them is because I believe that there was a spectrum of violence which has haunted us since 47, because the template of that was replicated exactly in 84, in 91, in 2002. And my novel, The Radiance of a Thousand Suns, attempts to explore that issue, to look at the violence which sort of undergirds these two cataclysms. And I try to tell it through a woman's perspective because I feel that our history is really his story, right from independence when we celebrate, 15th of August 1947, and rightly so, but there is very little mention or memorializing around partition, which is an event which was a cataclysm. And similarly, the stories of women, there were very few documentation on that. In fact, when you look at it, it's really data, which is very dry. And also the way women talk about violence is not recorded. For instance, in both in 47 and 84, when women were brutalized and they talked about it, they would use euphemisms like they were badly used. And the person who's recording it doesn't realize or doesn't want to record that this is an incident of rape. So these were all these stories which are sort of undergirding my attempt to sort of drive the narrative. And The Radiance of a Thousand Suns, therefore, is a story which is, the protagonist is Nikki Nalva, who, when her father passes away, she is left with his legacy to finish his book. And that is his life's work. So the story is written like a thriller because she has to chase down a mysterious immigrant woman in New York City whose story is the spine of the book. But Jyoth, who is this person, is not willing to tell her story because Jyoth has actually suffered both in 1947 and 1984. So this is a novel of trauma, and there is a lot of back and forth which happens as Nikki tries to tell Jyoth, get Jyoth to disclose a story, and Jyoth won't. And with this in the backdrop is the sort of 70-year history with the milestones from 47 to 77, 84, 9/11, which is unfolding.
So one of the really line that has stayed with me and which struck me when I read also, and which I would like you to elaborate on, is a sorority of dangerous ideas. So it's actually this woman, Noora, in the novel, who sort of epitomizes all of this. And when the young Nikki is listening to all these stories between, going back and forth between her Dadi and Noora, is when she encounters that these are women that she has never ever seen anywhere, and these ideas are really dangerous. Would you like to talk to us a little bit about Noora, being an atheist, being walk like a peacock and all of that?
Yeah, so just to give a backdrop to what Preeti said, so when I wanted to write this novel, which is really about violence against women, I was very clear that I had to put women up front and center stage because, violence against women has been commodified. It is a trope. So the way I deal with it is I give women the agency and make women the narrators of this story. And I have 4 characters. There's Dadima, there is Noora, Jyoth, and Nikki. And Nikki has a daughter as well who has a small role to play. So there are 5 women characters. And Noora is really sort of the moral compass of the book. She's also the person who raises Nikki because Nikki's mother dies in childbirth. And Noora herself is a low-caste, poor Muslim woman. She was a child when she fled the violence of 1947 and gets taken in by this family. So she's also grown up in the same household. And Noora is a person who says that, there's a line in the book when I say Noora, doesn't fear God, she fears flies because, she has seen all those rotting carcasses and the flies on top of them. So anyway, Noora is an atheist. She speaks her mind and she is fearless. And when Nikki is growing up, she's exposed to the ideas of Noora and Dadima, who discuss everything under the sun. And for a child growing up, that is an excellent environment to be in because where do children get their role models from? And in writing this novel, what I have also done is the narrative is strung on a scaffolding of the Mahabharata, and the reason for that is that it is a foundational epic. To the extent that when you read the narratives in 1947, the way people made sense of that violence was they said it is the pralay, which was foretold in the Mahabharata, which in Punjabi is called parle. So I use that also because Mahabharata has Draupadi, who is sort of a foremost female character, and I wanted to give agency back to her. So it's women like Draupadi and Noora who are undergirding this narrative.
I know that you also have this whole thing about the strong Punjabi woman or the lack of finding this, played out in this macho culture, but we'll come to that. You actually do tie in a lot of the strands that we've already talked about over here in your fascinating book, which is travelogue and adventure and a very detailed insight into everyday happenings and what has been going on in Punjab over the last many years. But first of all, tell us about this gaze, because you say the gaze is that of an outsider, since you say quite elaborately like you don't have any ID over there as such.
Yeah, hello everybody, and it's been fascinating listening to both of them. And before I just come to the gaze, I have a small thing to add to Manreet's. She said she has been writing for 19 years. I have been writing almost for the same time, though I got published only a decade back. Uh, every book I try to write about Punjabi women, and I can't. I don't even get to know their stories. You know, when Godra happened, I quit my job. I left for Delhi. I thought I'll record testimonies of 84, but I was a man and I can't go to the widows' colony. The women won't speak to me. Even this, I spent more than 150 nights and days in Punjab over 2 years. I would be welcome as a guest, and I would go unannounced. I would just ask people in a village to host me, and I would still be meeting men. The women won't meet me. And I really feel that many more, there has been some male voice coming from Punjab recently, but I think there was a huge voice earlier which has actually ebbed. But I hope that women voices come out, and whether it is Manreet or it is Malika or it is Preetika or Gunreet or all of these women who are writing nowadays, I feel like good. At least we are hearing that voice, because one half of society. And this actually ties into my gaze question also, because there is this insider outsider thing, and Punjab has been at the crossroads of world history for more than 3,000 years. Everybody who came into Central Asia, from Central Asia into the subcontinent, came through Punjab, and we are a mix of people. Scythians, Huns, Mongols, Persians, Greeks, all of them came here. Yet Punjab, for its very necessity, it needs to define who is an insider and who is an outsider, who belongs to the village, who belongs to the home, and who will come and disrupt or invade or spoil. It isn't relaxed like Bangalore is with outsider like me living here, making home here. Punjab actually looks at you cautiously. And I have tried, though I'm an outsider, I wasn't born there, don't live there, but the blood in my veins is Punjabi, and this whole book was to understand the texture of my blood, actually.
And the fact that during the course of your travels over 3 years or more, going to all these villages, and I think all the stories that are there in this book are really grassroots stories. So it's ordinary people, everyday stories, and also everyday challenges and conflicts. Some of them big and some of them not so big, but each one of them speaks of what is the problem with Punjab. So one is to tell us maybe one of the stories which is there, but also to tell us about this perception. What does India think of Punjab, and what is Punjab actually now?
Yeah, this is a few years back at a talk in Germany, actually, and my host was a person from the Balkans. And once I finished talking, that was about roll of honor, he said, "You guys are in a double bind, you know." And that phrase struck to me. I went and looked it up, and I realized that indeed, there is in Punjab, I mean, Muhammad Shah's famous poem, Jang Hind Punjab the Hone Laga, so that is quoted very often during the Khalistan movement, it was at least. But there has been a tussle of rights between the center and Punjab, and we cannot deny it. And government after government has tried to exploit it. Though Punjab stood up not only in history but even in the food crisis of India in the 60s, just after partition, Punjab stood up. 1.5% of the land fed the whole country for 3 decades. And then there has been the after effects of that. And the center has not done anything for it. So there is that aspect. But then there is also this aspect of inside Punjab, how the two political parties keep fighting with each other and nobody resolves any issue. So that remains a problem. So what I try to do is go to the ground and look up, and I'll give you a very sort of odd story near Nilon Canal on the way to Ludhiana. I was tracking the Buddha Nala. The Buddha Nala to me is perhaps the route that Guru Gobind Singh took when he escaped from Chamkaur Sahib fort, when they were under assault by the Mughal army. And I go into the shop of a guy because I'm unsure of where to turn the car. And he's a Hindu gentleman. And I ask him, why do you, have a shop selling basically ladies' garments just outside a village, like I said, why isn't this shop in a city? How difficult is it for you to go to Ludhiana and sell these things? He said, but I am from Ludhiana. I actually travel out every day 30 kilometers to run this shop. And I said, why would you do that? And he tells me that it is good business. Ludhiana is overcrowded, too busy. This is almost a highway. And there are so many women in the neighboring villages who can come here and buy from me. And it actually makes good business sense. And he's a Hindu gentleman. And I say, 30 years? But that was a time of militancy. And weren't you unsafe? And he takes the name of a militant who was very dreaded at that time. His name is the same as my father's name, Rashpal Singh Chanda. And he says, no, this was Rashpal's area. And I'm like, so? He said Rashpal had made it clear that nobody would loot from anybody here. He had actually kept the Indian state out of his fiefdom. And he did that for 12 years. He was a young farmer, so angry with Operation Blue Star, 8 years actually. He started, he challenged the Indian system and got into enough encounters with the police. Police could never identify him. They picked up his parents, tortured them. His father died. They even arrested him once, but they did not know who he was. He ran away. And then finally, he again was captured. And thousands upon villagers marched onto the police station when he was declared dead. Because what they wanted to do with him is burn him off or throw him in a canal. And they got his body back full of torture marks because every single villager there knew that Rashpal was never against us, whether Hindu or Sikh. And this ties back into an older culture of Punjab, when we had, after the Guru period, when we had missals, and missals had areas from where they would collect taxes, and they would create these clannish areas where there would be independence. So Rashpal was actually harking back to an earlier norm through which the society had gone through, but in a new state. That was his fault.
Yeah. It's also, I mean, like all these many contradictions, including with this, with Rashpal Singh, the many contradictions that one sees also throughout your book, because each chapter seems to bring a fresh lot of information, but also things that are contrary to then that information. So all of this stuff about Punjab, of course, is about a state, and what does that bring, the kind of vulnerability that brings. Punjab is a land of farmers, but what's happening to the farmers now? Punjab is the land of 5 rivers, but where are these rivers now, and what has happened to them? And Punjab and its brave soldiers. I mean, another trope that we've heard over and over again. And what? So I know we have very little time, but if we could just do that and then try and open it up to audience questions.
So there are these 3 myths through which Punjab is known. And there were 2 binaries through which my life has been, like the 3 myths basically are great food, great music, great clothing, These are the myths. But most of the great food of Punjab is not cooked in Punjab homes. It is cooked in Punjab restaurants. We no longer have tandoors there, right? Most of the good food is tandoor food. Similarly, the music, from the bhangadas and the gidda and all those kind of music that was there, to what has happened with the influence of Eminem and rap music of Honey Singh and Badshah and all these guys, is that, yeah, it is good music, we can dance to it, it works out in dance floors very well. But have you ever looked at the lyrics of these songs? And I remain so thankful that people don't understand the lyrics, because they are mostly, they are very feudal, very patriarchal, and very misogynistic. You know? So, and the third, food, clothing genuinely has traveled, and I'm glad for it. I mean, like, yes, more people have, mostly women have greater flexibility of clothing now. The men actually don't really have it. I mean, if you look at the Pakistan, Punjab, everybody wears shalwars and long kurtas. Here we don't wear shalwars, like, so. But the two, real binaries with which I grew up, and which has, my writing is a response to those, is when I was a kid and we were growing up in Rourkela in Odisha, people would say Punjab is a land of farmers and soldiers. People would address my father as Sardar Ji. There was a G attached to it. We didn't ask for it, it was given to us. In the 80s, when I was an adolescent, we were suddenly terrorists and traitors. And the G fell off. And I have just been responding to these two sort of points on the bandwidth and trying to talk about them.
I mean, just add
yeah.
a personal anecdote on that. I joined the Foreign Service in '83, and in '84, soon after Operation Blue Star, and during Operation Blue Star, newly married, I was in Amritsar through that period. And soon thereafter, I went on my first overseas assignment in Egypt to learn Arabic language. Within about 8 or 9 months of our arrival, Rajiv Gandhi was to come on a state visit. I wasn't allowed anywhere near the visit. That was the level of distrust of Sikhs. And those days I used to wear a turban. Nobody bothered to understand that I was agnostic or borderline atheist or whatever. But the fact that I wore a turban meant that I couldn't be kept near the visit. So that's the kind of trauma that a large part of the Sikh community went through. Another colleague of ours, Navdeep Sarna, who recently retired as our ambassador to Washington, had to be rescued during the riots in '84 by Foreign Secretary Salman Haider, literally in the trunk of his car. Those days, fortunately, the civil servants had ambassadors which could fit at all Sardar.
I think all of us have these stories in our families, of course, of partition, and then many of us have stories of '84 as well. I know I have one as well, which came out somewhere or the next, but yeah. Anyway, to round it off, the women, but I think just 1 minute. The strong women of Punjab, because we've seen them, they are in our families and we've encountered them everywhere, but then you don't find them out. There's no women's movement as such, or issues that they take up specifically. Would anybody like to address that? And then we go out.
Yeah, what Preeti is talking about is actually a very contrarian sort of strain that runs through Punjab. When I was growing up, and I grew up in a Punjabi Sikh household, so maybe it's specific to that. My mother was certainly a feminist, and somebody nobody would sort of contradict. I grew up with a lot of such female role models who were the template for me when I was writing Radiance, because I did not see these women tiptoeing around men, and that is despite the sort of the patriarchy of Punjab as a society, which I started to understand once I moved out of Punjab. And in fact, it's something that I find it difficult to sort of correlate myself. I mean, as a culture, of course, as Amandeep mentioned, Punjab was always at the crossroads. So this was a place where the marauders would come in and they would, take everything that they could, and women were especially vulnerable. So there is, we understand why it existed, but certainly the women that I grew up with were the kind of women that, would stand up to just about anybody. And it's only when I moved out of Punjab that I realized that women do actually tiptoe around men in a large part of sort of Indian society. So I guess my novels are an attempt to sort of understand that contradiction myself.
Thank you.
Yes, Tamil origin, but political science professor of Punjab University, Chandigarh, told me this. When I really missed Anna Saru in Chandigarh, I went to her home. I said, "Give me sambar. I need to eat it." Like I live in the South India. And she told me, she said, there has not been a single women's movement in Punjab. I mean, many states have had it. But then on my explorations, I found at least two or three which I could really call something. And one was who sadly lost the elections, because we see elections as that kind of a thing now. Electoral politics to me is entirely corrupted. But Bibi Paramjeet Kaur Khalra, for example, or Bibi Inderpal ji, who runs the Pingalwada at Amritsar, and one girl whose story I have tried to capture. There was a big militant attack in a village called Sevawala near Jaito. It's called the Sevawala Kand also. And this girl was 6, 7 years old, and her father had tried to fight the militants and died in the encounter, Meghraj Paktwana. His daughter Bindu now heads the Punjab Khet Majdoor Union's women wing. And she drives a truck and she takes the women everywhere on rallies, and I'm very proud of her.
So on that note, we open it up. 2 questions maybe, and that's all the time we have.
We have a volunteer with the mic.
My question is to all three of y'all. I mean, anyone can answer. So anytime we talk about Jallianwala Bagh or partition or any of the incidents that you've mentioned here, even in our history textbook when I study in school, there's inevitably a sort of negative emotion that goes towards Brits because of all the atrocities that they've committed against our ancestors before. So do you think it's a justified emotion to bring about in the younger generation, like hatred towards them? I mean, I'm not saying hatred, but just a negative emotion. It's not complete hatred, it's just a little negativity towards them, at least at that moment. Even if it fades away later, it's still there in that moment.
If I could try and respond, Preeti. This issue came up when we were doing a session on Khuni Vaisakhi at the British Library in London. And several young British Indians felt very emotional about the incident. And the issue came up, should the Brits apologize? And the issue has come up time and again. Would that heal? Would that be cathartic? It came up during Queen Elizabeth's visit to Amritsar. It came up during Prime Minister David Cameron's visit to Amritsar. And yet, they couldn't get themselves to say sorry. And then this sort of Kim Wagner, who's written a beautiful book on Jallianwala Bagh, came up with this thing that perhaps a better way to fix it would be that let the schools at least teach a proper history rather than the whitewashed, pun unintended, version, which is that all was glorious in the imperial rule. So I think a better way to address this would be for the British education system to at least start acknowledging some of the misdeeds, and especially some of the most egregious ones like Jallianwala Bagh. That could bring some of the closure that you refer to.
I don't see it as black and white as hatred. Remember, we are using the English language to talk all this. That also came from them. However you respond to that aspect of your life. But I would like to remind us about something else here. It's about power and hegemony. 100 years after Jallianwala Bagh, this year when the centenary came, the state government and the central government squabbled over how to do it. Right? So Vice President Venkaiah Naidu went there, and Captain Amrinder Singh was there, and okay, some celebration, some day was marked. At the same time, hundreds and thousands of farmers and labor from across Punjab wanted to reach Jallianwala Bagh to also commemorate it. but they were all blocked outside Amritsar city. They were not allowed to get in. And that is our own government. We are our own people.
I had a question. I found this talk very interesting. I'm a student of literature and I've just started studying Punjabi literature. I'm ethnically Punjabi and I'm exploring the works of Upendranath Ashk. And I found it very interesting because when you were talking about the Punjabi identity, what came to the forefront was that of the Sikhs. But the literature that I've read so far brings forth a very multifarious Punjabi identity where you have the Muslims on one hand, you have the Sikhs on the other hand, and within the Hindus you have various caste levels. So I just wanted to ask, how does that Punjabi identity represent itself today, where it's not just about being a Sardar, but there are many other ways of being Punjabi? And within that, what role does patriarchy play? Because I do know, perhaps, as ma'am pointed out, that in certain Sikh households, there was a matriarch and she did have power. It was a feminist sort of ideology that took hold, but there were other sects within that same Punjabi identity where the woman perhaps didn't have that same power. So I would like just maybe the whole panel to comment on the different Punjabi identities and the women there.
Okay, let me sort of take a shot at it. I think what you're talking about, the Punjabi identity, where you know it's a shared cultural milieu which is irrespective of the religion or the faith, whether it's Hindu, Muslim, or Sikh. I feel that sort of Punjabiyat partition, unfortunately, did truncate. And post-partition, for instance, the Punjab that exists in Pakistan, which is West Punjab, is Pakistan took a route of Islamization. So if you go to Punjab, that Punjab versus East Punjab, which is the Punjab that we know, you can see the difference. I think there is an extent to which that Punjabiyat exists, but it is more nostalgia. It's more a sort of harking back to a certain way of life, which if you read literature of that time or if you talk to people of that generation, a lot of whom are now very old or have passed away, you will get a sense of what that means, which is for instance, I'm working on a novel where I actually use this, like the name Iqbal. There could be Iqbal Singh, there could be Iqbal Chand, there could be Iqbal Malik. Like Malik is a surname where you don't know. It could be a Punjabi Hindu, a Punjabi Muslim, a Punjabi Sikh. So that, unfortunately, partition did sort of tear that asunder. And as you mentioned with women, for instance, in The Radiance of a Thousand Suns, if you get a chance to read it, one of the threads that I trace is, and that's what Nooran says, that if women were in charge of, sort of deciding how societies are structured, we would never have religion as a dividing force. Because for a woman, there is no religion, right? It's women are incorporated into a religious system because men need their progeny to be part of who they are. But for a woman, the progeny, a woman doesn't need a religion to define her children. So, that's my take on it.
Thank you.
Time's up, although we could have had you something from the caste chapter, but I think you need to get the book because you need to get all the 3 books to learn about Punjab and to know Punjab. Thank you.